Hello everyone, welcome back to Clinical Psychology Community UK. I am Holly and I am currently an NHS assistant psychologist. I'm doing a slightly different format today, so as you can see there's no PowerPoint. It's all a bit scary. I feel a bit weird without having my PowerPoint, but you can see more of my face, which hopefully will help. Today we are going to be talking about 5 of the best psychology books for pre-qualified clinical psychologists. I have purposefully not said aspiring clinical psychologists because I think it validates us more, our experience, if we say pre-qualified. And it's also more in line with the BPS way of looking at things as well. So let's get straight into it. These are 5 of the books that I have found really, really helpful on my journey and my understanding about clinical psychology and for, personal and professional development. So I hope these help you as well. Number 1 is How to Become a Clinical Psychologist by Laura Golding and Judith Moss. It is part of a series that's been edited by David Murphy, who was previously the BPS president, on how to become a practitioner psychologist. In that series as well, you've got occupational, counselling, educational, and sport as well. This one is about clinical psychologists. It was published in 2019, so it's really, really up to date, which is helpful. And if you are interested in getting this book, then it's available at the moment for $13.49 on Amazon as of March 2021 and $14.99 at Waterstones. And I will make sure I link those down below in the description. So for me, How to Become a Clinical Psychologist really is a great starting place for someone who's considering a career in clinical psychology. It provides really clear and, up-to-date information about what clinical psychologists do, what studying psychology at an undergraduate level will entail, what you would need to do to become a clinical psychologist, how to become a trainee, how to be a trainee and what that experience is like, and also being a newly qualified clinical psychologist. So it gives you loads of information. For me, it's an absolute must read for anybody thinking about becoming a clinical psychologist, but particularly for early career or, at university, I think it's really helpful because it has all of the basics in. It contains days in the lives of different psychologists. So it has a couple of different career stage clinical psychologists, listing what a typical day looks like for them. So you can really get a feel of what it is like to be a clinical psychologist. It also contains, which is really helpful, lots and lots of tips about doctoral applications and interviews. And this is why I am still recommending this book for people that have applied multiple times, because it still has really relevant information in about applications and interviews. And hopefully I don't have to make another application. Hopefully this is the year. But if I do, then I know that I'll come back to this book. So it is very useful. A couple of the limitations for me, it contains quite basic information. So if you, like me, have applied lots of different times, this book is not going to necessarily teach you very much that's new. It might confirm all the things that you already know, but it's not necessarily going to teach you anything. And it's not necessarily a book that you will revisit too often for development, like some of the other books that I'm going to recommend. It's the only time I probably will come back to this book is when thinking about tips for applications and interviews. That's probably the only time. But overall, I would rate this a 4.5, 4 out of 5 even, a 4 out of 5. I think it's a great place to start. If you are really early on in your career or at university thinking about clinical psychology, this book is worth it. It's not expensive and it will give you lots of different information. So definitely have a look. Book number 2 is Professional Issues in Clinical Psychology, Developing a Professional Identity Through Clinical Psychology Training and Beyond. It's a collection of essays that's been edited by Will Curvis. It's got various different essays with lots of different authors, some, various career stages, with later on career stage clinical psychologists, trainee clinical psychologists, and course staff as well. It's split into 3 parts. So the first part is challenges in learning to deliver psychological therapy through clinical psychology training, which is obviously a very big part of training. The second part is understanding the broader role of clinical psychology, and professional issues across areas of practice. The third part is developing a professional identity as a clinical psychologist and how to integrate the personal and the professional into that identity. It was first published in 2020, so it is massively up to date and relevant to clinical psychology now. And if you are interested, you can get it for $21.31 at Amazon and $24.99 at Waterstones as well, which I will link down below. Let's get into the critique then. So for me, lots of the strengths of this book are they're very thought-provoking essays looking at identity within clinical psychology. Identity as a psychological therapist, what your professional identity is. And I think inherently then it makes you think about your personal identity as well. So it really makes you think. A lot of these essays really make you think. It's also a book that you can revisit at various career stages, I think, as your identity develops. Because my identity now as an assistant psychologist is not going to be the same as my identity when I'm a trainee, when I've learned some more things, and when I'm qualified, and when I'm a senior clinical psychologist. It's not going to be the same. So I think this will help. You can revisit it, and it will help you develop across all of those times. Thirdly, I think this book is really good because it considers wider issues in clinical psychology, particularly risk, the welfare benefit system, social justice, ethics. It really considers a lot of broader areas, which sometimes we don't think about very easily. But these things are very topical at the moment. They're very important in clinical psychology at the moment. So that is another massive bonus to this book. It also helps you reflect on your identity and your experiences personally and professionally and how they relate to each other. And the essays are relatively short, they're quite bite-sized, with lots of useful references for further reading, and it's very easy to digest. I think this book is. You're not confused when you finished it. There's not a huge amount of reflection needed to understand the material. I think if you do some of the reflective exercises or some of the suggestions within the book, I really think you'll benefit from it. Thinking about a couple of the limitations for me, I think it's probably better suited to trainees because the context is about training, and I'm not sure whether it is a recommended text on any of the courses, but I think it probably should be because it is useful. There's not a lot in there about pre-qualified, pre-training clinical psychologists, but I think it's still useful to start thinking about your identity before you get to training. I think it can be a really helpful tool to help you prepare for interviews and things like that. And I think the other thing for me is if I had read this earlier on in my career, after my first application, I'm now on 6 applications, I think I would have found this quite difficult to understand. Not that, that the language is confusing. I just think that I would have been unable to connect the dots. I quite often think about my clinical psychology journey, and I have lots of different pieces of information with some lines that are starting to connect to each other. And that was very much at the early stages. I couldn't see the connections and I couldn't make sense of it. But now I feel like I can see a broader picture. I can understand clinical psychology. I can kind of see some of the links. So this book makes sense in the context of my picture of clinical psychology. Whereas, like I said, if I read this earlier, I think I just would have found it quite overwhelming. But that's an interesting reflection in itself. So what would I rate this? I would rate this a 4 out of 5. I think it does have some quite advanced material, and probably better suited to trainees, but I think it's still useful for people that are in pre-training roles like assistants, PWPs, support workers. I think there's still lots of value in this book for you. So definitely have a look down below and see if you can get a copy. Now the third one I want to talk to you about is quite a well-known one. It's The Skeleton Cupboard by Dr. Tanya Brown. Essentially, Dr. Tanya Brown is a clinical psychologist, and the book sort of has a narrative where she talks about her own experiences of clinical psychology training. But it's not written as like a reflective journal. It's written like a piece of fiction. Like, it's very, very readable, and it has a really strong narrative throughout it. It was published in 2015, but I think Dr. Brown trained a few years ago when training was a little bit different. So yeah, that's just something to bear in mind when you read it. It's another one of the cheaper ones to get. I've tried to keep things in a good price range in this video, so you can get it for £9 and a penny at Amazon as of March 2021, and you can get it for £10.99 at Waterstones as well. So some of the strengths for me, it gives you some idea of what training might be like, although it's slightly outdated. So I read this about a year ago when I had been unsuccessful in gaining a place after an interview on the doctorate for my 5th application, and I thought, well, I probably need to get a little bit more into some of the literature and maybe understand what training is a little bit more. So I bought the book, and it does give you some idea of what training will be like, particularly in terms of the supervisory relationship. There's quite a lot in there about, from my recollection, about her supervisor and the nature of that relationship. And for me, I found it quite helpful to compare our experiences with supervisors and reflect on it, and maybe think about how I would handle similar situations currently, or when I'm on training, or things like that. It also validates how challenging training can be and the struggles of people working in clinical psychology, especially with things like risk. Quite a lot of the stories that she talks about, she doesn't shy away from saying how difficult clinical psychology is to work in and to train in. It's a very demanding program. And I like the fact that it doesn't perpetuate the idea that trainees are superhumans and you get onto training and then you're perfect. You will make mistakes. We all make mistakes all the time, and that's okay. It's part of the role. It's part of the training. So I like the fact that it validates that. And as I said before, it's written in a really easy to read way. I picked it up and I could not put it down. I think I read it I read it definitely within 24 hours of picking it up. It was brilliant to read. And I think it can be revisited. And I am going to read it again, actually, with it, now, after a year of first reading it, and a year where there's been quite a lot of development for me. Where I've been an assistant for the first time, and got more into reflective models and supervision. So yeah, I'm going to reread it and see what happens. In terms of the limitations, as I've already said, Dr. Brown did train quite a few years ago now, so those experiences aren't necessarily representative of what training will look like now, but it's still a great book. So my overall rating for that one, again, is a 4 out of 5. I have to say it's a 4 out of 5 again, because I don't think it's quite a 5 out of 5, and I don't think it's deserving of anything less than that. I definitely would recommend it. Moving on to the 4th book. Now, this is not a very well kept secret in psychology, and nor should it be. It is the Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy book, edited by Lucy Johnstone and Rudi Dallos, and it is a core text on most of the courses out there, because what you'll be learning on the course is a lot about formulation. So generally it has a series of chapters covering the basics of psychological formulation, and particularly with different approaches to formulation, so systemic, CBT, psychodynamic, integrative, all of those sorts of things. It was published, this second edition was published in 2014, I think. To my knowledge, it's the latest edition as of the time the video was published. It is one of the more expensive ones, but if you are looking to work in clinical psychology, you're eventually probably going to need it anyway. So I would just buy it if you can. Available currently for $31.49 at Amazon at the moment, and $37.99 at Waterstones. So I will make sure I put that down below. So for me, some of the strengths, it covers loads of different models. So there will be something in there for you. If you like CBT, it's there. If you like psychodynamic, systemic, integrative, it's all there for you. All the main approaches that you will be using in clinical psychology will be there. It also covers issues of social inequality and power in formulation in clinical psychology. Very topical at the moment. Lucy Johnstone, one of the editors, also is involved in the power threat meaning framework. So if you haven't heard of that, have a Google of power threat meaning, and I will link down below a link to the BPS information about it. So that's very topical, and it is in there. So I'm really pleased that that is in there, and I think it's useful to consider. I think, in fact, we have to consider social inequality and power, particularly when we are formulating and working with clients, and the nature of that relationship. Quite often we are perceived as expert or the professional, and the other person is perceived as the person who needs help. Or the vulnerable one. So thinking about those dynamics in formulation is very, very important, and it's in the book. And it also covers controversies and debates regarding formulation in clinical psychology that it's important for us to be aware of. I think it's useful to help you reflect on your experiences of using formulation as well. When you're learning about formulation, you can sort of reflect on experiences that you've had, thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure that formulation, maybe that could be involved, or, it gives you different ways of thinking about stuff. And for me, the limitation is more a bit of cautionary advice. I think you'll get the most out of this book if you are working in some capacity with formulations and with clients, and you have space to discuss that in clinical supervision, or alongside teaching and practice, like on the doctorate, for example. I think I've rated this a 5 out of 5. It's an absolute essential for anyone working with formulation. And as we know, psychologists work in a very structured framework of assessment, formulation, intervention, evaluation. So formulation is a massive part of that. So I definitely think you should look into getting this book or borrowing it. I'll put all the links down below if you are interested. Our fifth and final book, this is probably not a surprise to anyone who follows me on Instagram, is the Surviving Clinical Psychology book. Surviving Clinical Psychology, Navigating Personal, Professional and Political Selves on the Journey to Qualification. It's, again, a collection of essays. It's edited by James Randall, and the essays explore identity, personal issues, wider societal issues surrounding clinical psychology. And it's split into 4 parts, not 8, 4. Firstly is the context of clinical psychology. Secondly is the personal, so the selves as human, who we are as people, and our identities and our issues that we might go through. Part 3 is the professional. It's the use of the self in clinical psychology. Part 4 is the political, selves and politics in practice. I will talk a little bit more about that when we come on to the strengths, but just so you know, this book was published in 2020. I would recommend this for anyone who is on the journey to qualification, anyone at all, and I will probably use this post-qualification as well. I think it's fantastic. It is available for $21.31 at Amazon and $24.99 at Waterstones. And I should say, I haven't been sponsored, by the way, by Amazon or Waterstones. I've just given you 2 different options because some people don't like to use Amazon. Right, so let's move on to the strengths. Firstly, it is packed with reflective exercises, things like the social graces, self-formulation, family scripts, and it has lots of questions in there to help you digest and process that information discussed. It's really thought-provoking. It covers the personal, professional, political identities. Again, with the political stuff, it's hugely topical, and we're starting to realise the importance of thinking about that stuff in clinical psychology, and hopefully that will continue. So that's a massive strength to this book, is that it has an entire part on politics and political identities and how politics comes into clinical psychology practice. It also signposts you to lots of useful organisations. For example, Psychologists for Social Change, Breaking Mad on YouTube. Have a look on them. They've got some brilliant videos available. I'll link them down below as well. You can revisit this book many times, and I intend to, as I said, throughout my career. It's suitable for any career stage, university to consultant, I would say. Absolutely. I think it's interesting because it has so many exercises that will be different when you're an assistant and when you're newly qualified and when you are a consultant. It will all be different every time. There will be changes. So I think it would be interesting. This is a really important point. It validates our struggles. This whole book, the title is Surviving Clinical Psychology. Not getting to clinical psychology, not achieving clinical psychology. It's surviving it. It's so important, and it has so many different voices in there. It actually has pre-qualified voices, which none of the other books have got. None of the books that I've read advising, aspiring psychologists, pre-qualified psychologists, actually have pre-qualified voices. Whereas this book has them on equal level to consultants and to very experienced psychologists. And that makes me feel valued as a pre-qualified psychologist. And it kind of helps me feel that I do have some skill and that my voice is useful and I do have experiences that matter. And not just people with the qualification matter. That's the important message, I think, with this book. Above everything else, that message, it's really empowering above everything else, as well as all the empowering exercises in there. Yeah. In terms of limitations, I only really have one. It's not skim reading. I would say that you would get the most out of the book if you dedicate some time to it. That was my experience anyway. I mean, I would dedicate an hour to do like a chapter potentially, but sometimes I wouldn't finish the chapter because I'd want to do the exercise. I would highly encourage you to do the exercises throughout. You can do them however works for you. You can do all the reading, then go back and do a couple of the exercises. But it's kind of like a textbook / workbook. It has exercises in that you really, really need to do. So it's not skim reading. You would not be able to finish that book in a day and get the same out of it if you had sat down and done some of the exercises. But overall, this is another 5 out of 5 for me. It's an absolute essential for anyone working in clinical psychology, or hopefully working in clinical psychology, or looking to, or training. Absolutely get this book. I can't recommend it enough. I really can't. And if any of your friends have got it, see if you can borrow it. I mean, I would lend mine out, but I've got lots and lots of notes. I don't know if you can see, but I've got loads of notes all throughout the book because I love to write on things. I really sincerely hope that helps with some of your preparation for interviews and things like that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if there are any other books that you could recommend that I need to read. I have also got quite a few books coming. A few honourable mentions, I have to say, that were just not included simply because of price for this one. It's Institutional Racism in Psychiatry and Clinical Psychology by Suman Fernando. It looks like this. I'll make sure it pops up. And I will link it down below as well. It costs about £50. That's why I've not put it in there. But it is a very, very useful book for anyone. I think, speaking as a white woman, trying to work in clinical psychology, I think it's our responsibility. It's absolutely our responsibility to read this stuff and understand the history behind it, and to check our privilege, and to manage our white guilt that we might have. So that is a highly recommended book. If you're interested in clinical psychology and CBT, I would recommend, it was actually a course textbook on my master's, and it was an introduction to CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, and it's a second edition, but they might have done a third by now, by Westbrook, Kennelly and Kirk. I will make sure I link that down below as well. So that has all of the stuff you need to know about CBT, and it's a really good place to start, I would say. I've got a couple more on my reading list, but I will hopefully do another video as we come up. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!